My name's Dylan McGarry. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Environmental Learning Research Centre at Rhodes University in South Africa. Our organisation works in many different countries, mostly in Southern Africa, and they're mostly injustices around nexus issues between climate, water, food security, waste, energy, and then also social injustices around street-level drug addiction and so on. I would say capitalist imperialism, which is kind of the root cause of most of these problems. Patriarchy, especially in South Africa, government corruption. And then just kind of institutionalized violence. One of the cases I'm working on in Durban, there's people who are street-level drug users who are being brutalized by the police, and any kind of responses that the Department of Health is trying to make get thwarted by the police. And so it's kind of like an institutional blindness or a lack of empathy, not intentional, but in the institutions themselves. And we see that in various spaces. We're doing many things. We have 9 particular case studies across the world in Vietnam, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, South Africa, India, Colombia, and Sweden and the Netherlands, where there's particular research where we're trying to understand transgressive learning, the learning that happens in activism, in resistance, in environmental justice and conflict movements, that kind of shifts people from just resisting a process and actually transforming it. As our research network and our organization, we're very interested in trying to understand learning. We're in an education department, but we're trying to understand the learning that happens outside of universities and schools and workplaces, but in spaces of justice. A really interesting example is the learning that's happening in Zimbabwe amongst farmers who are trying to create an organic farming movement in the height of a drought. And so they're having to diversify and transform traditional practices in order to maintain organic farming, but then at the same time deal with all the conflicts and differences of opinion that exist in that cultural community. So the learning that happens is transgressive when they change their practices together. So we're very interested in that, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand that, but also act in that. So we have researchers and activists at the same time. The main difficulties in our work are around the kind of structural, institutional blockages for transformation, the inability for people, people can show a lot of agency and initiative and innovation to transform the conditions that shape their lives, but at some point we meet some structural challenges. Sometimes they're very simple and can be dealt with and warmed up through various social processes. But I suppose in South Africa, the biggest one is corruption. We're really struggling with corruption. Recently, our president spent 250 billion South African rand on something we don't know. There's no trail, there's no documentation of what he used that money for. So we have at the highest level, we have corruption, and it seeps down. And so it makes any kind of rights-based movement very difficult because no one's really following any law. I think our one thing to achieve justice is our picture of justice needs to change. I think we need to be far more radical with what we think justice is. If we keep thinking that justice is just getting back what we lost, then we would just come back to a clean slate. I think that would be a great loss. I think what really needs is to reimagine everything. There's a woman in our network from Colombia who works with communities who are saving forests by living in them, and it's led by Indigenous communities. And they have a beautiful picture of justice and progress. The concept of progress is very hard for them to understand, but they imagine progress being a process of walking backwards, that you look at where you've come from and you want to make that which you love re-exist, but in a new way. And so they use the word resiste, which I think I've said it right. The word to resist and to re-exist sound very similar. So I think a true form of justice would be something where we're trying to re-exist in new ways, where we don't lose, we regain what is lost, but really incorporate whole new visions for beyond sustainability. I think a just future would be that nature had rights, that we would recognize the Cochabamba Declaration in 2010 for the Universal Declaration for Rights for Mother Earth. The moment all of nature is considered property, and corporations have more rights than whales or elephants or cattle in dairy farms. So I think for me, a great success and justice would be acknowledging the already existing rights that belong to all life, which would then also be finally acknowledging the rights of women, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and the rights of mountains to be mountains, rivers to be rivers, and a way of living living for the common good rather than living for the self.